My decision to save a man cost my work, but the outcome was unexpected. Hello. You are very welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The rain fell incessantly, as if the sky was lamenting something yet to come. Inside the hospital's emergency room, Sarah moved with agility, attending to the needs of each patient. Her emerald green uniform was stained with blood and sweat, but that didn't bother her. She was there to help, and that mission was her priority. The siren of the phone interrupted the constant noise of machines and the murmur of the sick. Sarah's heart raced. Urgent. Car accident on Highway 27. The operator's voice sounded through the speaker, clear and direct. Let's go, team. Get ready. Sarah shouted as she grabbed her first aid kit. Always ready for the unexpected, she had already witnessed the devastating impact of recklessness on the roads. We need an X-ray and O-positive blood in the emergency room. She had no idea what awaited her that night. As they arrived at the accident scene, the sight was breathtaking. The car was completely crushed, the metal twisted like paper. The rain made everything more complicated and slippery, and the cries for help mixed with the roar of the storm. "Sarah, watch out!" shouted one of her colleagues, pointing to the water-covered ground. "I'm fine. Focus on the victim," she replied, determined. With a sharp glance, she spotted an unconscious man in the driver's seat. "David, is that you?" she murmured, trying to decipher the man's identity. The car was parked at a strange angle, and blood was trickling from his head. "He's alive, but we need to act fast," Sarah ordered as she approached the vehicle. With steady hands, she opened the car door and carefully pulled David out, who was unconscious and without identification. "Call an ambulance to take him. We need to stabilize him before he loses more blood." Her heart raced, but adrenaline kept her focused. The journey to the hospital was a race against time. As the team performed emergency procedures, Sarah tried to maintain control. The man woke briefly, his confused eyes locking onto hers. Who am I?" he stammered before passing out again. "Calm down, you're safe now. We'll take care of you," Sarah murmured, holding his hand. The instant connection intrigued her. There was something more about this man. In the trauma room, the doctors worked frantically, but Sarah couldn't stop thinking about David. She felt compelled to know who he was. "Please don't leave me here without answers," she whispered as she watched the medical team stabilize him. Minutes turned into hours, and when David was finally taken to the intensive care unit, Sarah refused to leave the hospital. Her colleagues tried to convince her to go home, but she was determined. "Sarah, you need to rest," said one of the nurses, looking at her with concern. "I can't. He needs someone by his side." "I can't leave it like this," she replied, her gaze fixed on the ICU door. That night, as the rain continued to drum against the hospital windows, Sarah sat in a chair next to David's bed. The sound of the heart monitor was a familiar melody, but the uncertainty about the future left her restless. "You can't leave me, David," she spoke softly, as if he could hear. "I promised to find out who you are and why this happened." And as the storm outside intensified, an unshakable determination was born within her. Sarah knew her life was about to change in ways she could never imagine. She hadn't just saved a man. She was about to embark on a journey that would challenge all her beliefs about altruism and sacrifice. After the heroic rescue, Sarah found herself engulfed in a whirlwind of emotions. The intensive care unit was a cold, impersonal place, but she couldn't pull away from David. He was unconscious, surrounded by machines that beeped and flashed, the monitors displaying vital signs that seemed much more stable than the chaos reigning in her mind. "Why didn't you tell me your name?" Sarah thought, watching the man who had become her focus. The inexplicable connection she felt for him prevented her from abandoning her vigil. "He deserves a chance," she murmured to herself as she stood up to speak with the doctors. "I can't leave him here without knowing who he is." The doctor, a gray-haired man with a weary expression, looked at her with an understanding demeanor. "Sarah, I understand your concern, but we need to focus on his recovery," Not his identity, he said in a gentle voice. But what if he has family? What if he needs someone? I can't just ignore that, Sarah insisted, determination burning in her eyes. The doctor sighed, unsure of what to say. He knew the young paramedic had a huge heart, but he also understood the risks of becoming emotionally involved. In the days that followed, as David struggled to regain consciousness, Sarah began to investigate his life. She spent hours at the hospital, talking with nurses and seeking information about him. With each new piece of information she found, her heart tightened. The records were vague, filled with mentions of legal troubles and a murky past. Why does no one seem to care about him? She thought, frustrated. One night, while reviewing documents in the break room, she found a small business card with a phone number. If you care about him, call, the message said. Hesitant, Sarah picked up the phone and dialed the number. A female voice answered on the other end. Hello? Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm a paramedic and I'm taking care of a patient named David. Do you know him? She asked, her heart racing. David? Yes, I know him. But he's not a good person. You know that, right? The woman replied, her tone of disdain cutting through the air. I don't know anything about him, just that he needs help. And I want to help, Sarah said, her voice steady. The woman hesitated for a moment. He may have done bad things, but he could have also been manipulated. You need to understand that. If he remembers anything, there might still be hope. The words of that woman echoed in Sarah's mind. Manipulated? What do you mean? She asked, intrigued. David was involved with dangerous people. If you really want to help, be prepared for what you might discover, the woman warned before hanging up. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The idea of David being trapped in a cycle of violence and crime haunted her. He was a human being, with a life, hopes, and fears. She needed to do something, needed to ensure he had a chance. Days later, during one of her visits to the hospital, David finally opened his eyes, still with a lost look. Where am I? He murmured, his voice weak. You are safe now. My name is Sarah. I'm a paramedic. You had an accident? She responded, leaning closer, trying to convey calmness. I don't remember, he said, his expression anguished. It's okay. We'll figure this out together. Do you have family? Someone who can help? Sarah asked, watching his internal struggle. I don't know. It was all so confusing before the accident, he replied, tears in his eyes. At that moment, something inside Sarah solidified. David, I want to help you. I will find out who you are and I will stand by you, she declared, her voice firm and full of conviction. He looked at her, surprised. Why would you do that for me? I'm a complete stranger. Because you deserve a chance. Everyone deserves that, Sarah said, determined. The connection she felt for him only strengthened, and her mission was clear. She would not only care for him, she would fight for his life and for his truth. The decision was made, and nothing could stop her. The day of the trial finally arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was electrically charged. Sarah, her heart racing, entered the hearing room, feeling the weight of expectations on her shoulders. She was seen as a hero by some, but for others, especially her co-workers, her decision to defend David was a betrayal. The murmurs among those present were palpable, and she tried to ignore them, focusing on her mission. Are you ready for this? Asked a longtime friend, lawyer Tom, as she prepared to present her case. He had a look of concern, but Sarah was determined. I have no choice, Tom. He needs someone who believes in him, she replied, her voice steady. The judge entered, and a respectful silence enveloped the room. Sarah stood up, adjusting the folder containing her notes. Looking at David, sitting next to his lawyer, she felt a mix of empathy and responsibility. He looked vulnerable, but there was a spark of hope in his eyes. Sarah began her presentation, outlining the circumstances of the accident, emphasizing how David was not just a criminal but a human being who deserved a chance. What happened that night does not define who he is, she argued, her voice echoing off the courtroom walls. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and his choices do not reflect the entirety of his life. However, the evidence against David began to pile up. The prosecution's lawyer, an imposing man named Mr. Miller, presented evidence that made David's situation even darker. Sarah watched as Mr. Miller said, "This man is not an unsuspecting innocent. He has a criminal history, and his involvement in drug trafficking is not a mere coincidence." The air grew heavy with his words, and she felt the pressure of criticism intensifying. Her stomach churned. Doubt settled in her mind. "Am I doing the right thing?" she thought. The disapproving looks from some jurors were a constant reminder of the consequences of her choice. In the middle of her presentation, Sarah received an anonymous envelope, which caused her to pause for a moment. With trembling hands, she opened it and read the threat. "Give up defending David, or you will pay a heavy price." Her hands clenched into fists, and adrenaline coursed through her veins. That message could just be an attempt to intimidate her, but the words echoed in her mind, creating a whirlwind of insecurity. "Sarah, are you okay?" Tom whispered, noticing she had lost focus. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "I am," she replied, but the hesitation in her voice was unmistakable. "I just need to concentrate." The trial continued, and each day brought new challenges. Sarah saw how the prosecution team was determined to dismantle her defense, and the pressure became almost unbearable. She needed evidence that could help David, but the consequences of her decision haunted her. At the end of the day, as she left the courthouse, Sarah felt exhausted. The weight of the world seemed to be on her shoulders. As she exited, she saw Jake, her boyfriend, waiting for her. He looked pale, and the worry on his face was evident. "Do you really think this is a good idea?" he questioned, frustration showing in his voice. "You're putting yourself in danger." "Jake, I can't back down. He needs me," Sarah responded, trying to stay calm. "And are you willing to sacrifice everything for him? You're losing control." The argument escalated, and Sarah felt the sting of his words. The emotional distance between them seemed to grow with each passing day. She wanted him to understand, but Jake couldn't see beyond what was on the surface. "You're not seeing the truth. It's not just about what happened, but about what is right," Sarah shouted, frustrated. Jake shook his head, disappointed. "You need to reassess your priorities, Sarah. I can't stand by and watch you self-destruct." With that, he walked away, leaving Sarah alone, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. The trial continued, and with it, Sarah's internal struggle between what was right and what was safe. Determination drove her, but the threats and moral pressure made her question every step she took. And so, the battle for David's justice became not just an external struggle, but also a profound internal journey for Sarah. Sarah was determined to uncover the truth about David, the man she had saved in a car accident. The hospital where she worked was a place of life and death, but now, she felt she was at a moral crossroads, and her heart was pounding with anxiety. It wasn't just David's fate that was at stake, but also her own. In her mind, questions swirled endlessly. Who was he? What life had he led? The morning after her decision to defend David, Sarah began her investigation. The first stop was the apartment he had rented. Upon entering, she found a messy space, with boxes piled up and papers scattered. "It looks like he was moving out," she murmured to herself as she examined every detail. A dusty photo caught her attention. It was David, in a jovial moment, surrounded by friends. "This must be a clue," she thought, picking up the photo to examine it later. Sarah decided to visit the bar that was near the apartment. Upon entering, she was greeted by a strong smell of alcohol and smoke. The atmosphere was filled with men and women who seemed to ignore her presence. She approached the bar and asked the bartender, "Do you know a man named David? Did he used to come here?" The bartender, a sturdy man with a suspicious look, furrowed his brow. "David? The guy who got himself into trouble? I don't know if I can help." "Please, any information could be useful," Sarah insisted, feeling the urgency of the situation. He was associated with some strange types. I heard he was mixed up with drug trafficking, the bartender replied, looking around as if he feared being overheard. But, to be honest, he seemed different. Sometimes he came here just to drink and forget about life. Could you give me names? Or any other leads? Sarah asked, jotting everything down in her notebook. I don't know, miss. This is dangerous stuff. You'd better stay away, he said, avoiding further questions. Determined, Sarah decided to follow another lead and went to the community center in the neighborhood where David lived. Upon entering, she found a group of people engaged in leisure activities. Introducing herself as a paramedic and explaining David's situation, an elderly woman approached her. I knew David. He was good with the kids here. Always helped out. Do you know anything about his past? Sarah asked hopefully. He had problems, yes, but he also had a good heart. I heard he was involved with some dangerous people, but I can't say for sure. He was trying to change. I know that, the woman replied, with a sad look. With each new piece of information, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility increase. She knew there was a crime network around her, but she also sensed David's fragility, someone who, at his core, could be innocent. Throughout the day, she collected more testimonies and information, creating an increasingly complex profile of the man she was trying to save. But the pressure was mounting. As she left the community center, Sarah was approached by a man who seemed familiar. It was Marco, a childhood friend of David. Sarah, you shouldn't be getting involved in this, he said, with a worried look. David got mixed up in dangerous things. You could get hurt. Marco, I can't give up on him. He needs someone who believes in him, Sarah replied, determined. But this isn't just a trial. There are people who will want to silence you. Don't forget, he might not be who you think, Marco warned, before quickly walking away. Marco's words echoed in Sarah's mind as she returned home. Each new discovery took her deeper into the web of lies and deceit surrounding David. The line between right and wrong began to blur, but Sarah couldn't give up. She was determined to fight for David, even if it meant facing unknown dangers. The truth was out there, and she was willing to unearth it, no matter the cost. Sarah's relationship with her boyfriend, Jake, was beginning to crumble. The weight of the decision she had made to defend David in court hung over her like a thick fog, and the conversations that had once been filled with complicity were now permeated by an uncomfortable silence. Jake, worried and frustrated, couldn't understand why Sarah refused to give up on a man who, in his eyes, was clearly a criminal. On a night when the rain pounded against the windows, Jake could no longer contain his indignation. Sarah, you're putting your life at risk for someone you don't even know. He could be guilty of terrible things, he said, his voice rising in pitch. Jake, I can't just ignore the chance to help someone who's being wrongly accused. I've been there. I saw him. He needs someone who believes in him, Sarah replied, her gaze firm and determined. You're being naive, Jake shot back, crossing his arms. And what's wrong with you? You're distancing yourself from me because of him. I'm not distancing myself from you, Jake. I'm trying to do what's right. Sarah's voice trembled, but she stood tall. David could be a criminal, but he could also be a victim. People deserve a chance. The tension grew between them, and the exchanged words became sharper. Don't you see that this is just creating more problems for us? What are you going to do when all this is over? He won't be there for you, but I will. You don't understand anything about what I'm going through. Sarah shouted, her frustration overflowing. You're only thinking about yourself. Jake, hurt by her words, turned away, leaving the room in silence. Sarah sat on the couch, feeling alone and confused. The weight of the battle she had chosen to fight was immense, and the distance between her and Jake seemed to grow with each passing day. The next morning, still shaken by the fight, Sarah decided she needed to vent. She called her fellow paramedic, Lucas, who had always supported her. They met at a cafe near the hospital, where Sarah began to describe her internal struggle. Lucas, I feel like I'm losing everything. Jake doesn't understand why I'm doing this. He thinks I'm putting my life at risk, Sarah confessed, frustration evident in her tone. I understand why you're doing this, Lucas said, looking into her eyes. You've always had a big heart. If you believe David deserves a chance, then you should fight for it. Sometimes people can't see beyond the surface. But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm just deluding myself? Sarah questioned, her voice trembling. You can't be sure of anything in life. What you can do is follow your intuition and act according to your conscience. And if you need help, you will always have friends who will stand by you, Lucas replied, offering a comforting smile. The conversation with Lucas brought some relief to the emotional turmoil Sarah was feeling. However, the tension with Jake continued to loom over her. When she got home that night, Jake was sitting on the couch, staring blankly. Hi, he said, not looking up. Hi, Sarah replied, hesitantly. She knew the conversation needed to happen, but she didn't know how to approach it. Can we talk? Jake finally looked at her, his face showing a mix of concern and disappointment. Sure, Sarah said, sitting down next to him. I'm sorry about yesterday. I didn't mean to shout. I'm sorry too. I just worry about you. And it scares me, Jake confessed, running his hand through his hair. I understand, but I need you to support me, Jake. This is important to me, Sarah said, feeling the urgency to explain her decision. I just don't want you to get hurt. And, honestly, I can't understand how you can be so willing to risk everything for someone you don't know, Jake replied, his voice softening. I know it sounds crazy, but sometimes we have to fight for those who can't fight for themselves. And in this case, I feel that David deserves a chance. Sometimes everyone deserves a second chance, Sarah insisted, her eyes shining with the determination that drove her. Jake sighed, his expression softening. I just want you to be happy, Sarah. If that means fighting for him, then I'll try to understand. But please, don't forget about us in the process. I won't forget about us, she promised, feeling a slight relief as she realized that despite their differences, there was still room for understanding and support between them. The conversation brought them closer, but Sarah knew the battle was far from over. The dilemma between her convictions and Jake's feelings continued to be a source of tension, but she was willing to face the challenges ahead, both in the fight for David and in her relationship with Jake. During the hearing, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Nervous, Sarah sat between the lawyers, her heart racing. With each word spoken by the prosecutor, her mind reflected on the experiences that had brought her here. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with an authoritative demeanor, began to expose the weaknesses in David's case. But what bothered Sarah the most was how he seemed to exploit her personal wounds. Miss Sarah, do you really believe you can save this man? The lawyer questioned, addressing her with a sarcastic smile. When was the last time you looked in the mirror and recognized who you truly are? His words echoed in her mind, bringing forth memories she preferred to forget. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach, the memories of her childhood, the loss of her parents in an accident, and the sense of helplessness that had accompanied her throughout her life. The attempt to present herself as strong and selfless began to crumble under the pressure of the critical gaze from everyone around. I know who I am, Sarah replied, her voice steady but with a slight tremor. I'm someone who believes in justice. And David deserves a chance. Everyone deserves a chance. A chance? The lawyer insisted, raising his voice. And what about your past? Are you so desperate to help this criminal that you've forgotten about yourself? Don't you carry your own scars? The judge intervened, but Sarah felt her heart race. She remembered how she had always felt lost, as if navigating a sea of guilt and sorrow. The lawyer seemed to have found a chink in her armor, and she needed to protect herself. Determined, she paused, took a deep breath, and looked at the judge. Excuse me, Your Honor. May I address the jury? She requested, her voice firmer now. The judge nodded, and Sarah turned to the jury, a group of faces watching her intently. What the lawyer is trying to do here is undermine not only my struggle, but that of everyone who faces their own demons. Each of us carries our own story, and that doesn't make us any less worthy of compassion. She looked into the juror's eyes, trying to convey the sincerity she felt. I'm not here to save David because he's perfect. I'm here because, like all of us, he has made mistakes. But I also believe we can learn from them. I'm here to say that altruism isn't about forgetting who we are, but about recognizing our weaknesses and still choosing to do the right thing. After her words, Sarah felt a wave of vulnerability. The prosecutor hadn't expected that response, and the room fell silent. In a moment of weakness, she decided to seek support. In the days that followed, she began seeing a psychologist who helped her confront her past and understand that her experiences shaped her but did not define her capacity to act. Sarah, you need to release that pain. It's what's holding you back, the psychologist said as Sarah sat in a comfortable leather chair, tears streaming down her face. You are more than your traumas. You are a strong woman surrounded by challenges. But what if I fail? What if all of this costs David his life? Sarah questioned, insecurity evident in her voice. And what if you win? What if your struggle opens doors to healing, not just for you, but for David and others in the same situation? The psychologist replied, with an encouraging look. These conversations became a turning point for Sarah. She realized that while she was fighting for David, she was also fighting for herself, for the right not to be defined by her past experiences. This new perspective gave her renewed strength. In court, when she looked at David, she saw not just a lost man but a reflection of her own struggles and longings. The connection that began to form between them intensified, and Sarah felt more determined than ever to advocate not only for David but also for her own truth. With each step she took, she was not only facing a trial but also resolving the internal conflicts that had plagued her for so long. And for the first time, Sarah felt she was finally allowing herself to be seen and understood, both in court and in her own life. Sarah was in a state of growing anxiety. David's trial was approaching its climax, and despite all the effort she had put in, she felt something crucial was still missing to change the course of the case. In the past weeks, the weight of the evidence against him felt suffocating, and the pressure from the prosecution intensified with each hearing. One afternoon, while reviewing folders of documents and reports, an idea occurred to her. What if there was a witness who could change everything? Determined, she decided she needed to act. Sarah began her personal investigation, revisiting the places David used to frequent before the accident. With a notepad in hand and a recorder, she headed to a roadside bar where David had been seen for the last time before the incident. The place was empty, except for an old bartender cleaning glasses behind the counter. Hi, could you help me? Sarah asked, trying to adopt a friendly tone. I'm looking for information about a friend. His name is David. The bartender looked at her with a skeptical expression. David? You're not going to find much good about him here. The kid was into bad stuff. I know, but I need to understand more about him. I'm trying to help him, Sarah insisted, feeling her voice tremble. Do you know anyone who could talk about what happened that night? The bartender hesitated, looking around as if assessing the safety of the environment. Look, you don't understand what you might be getting into. David wasn't just a lost guy. He was involved with dangerous people. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I know, but he's not guilty of what they're accusing him of. I just need an alibi. Any information that proves he was somewhere else. The bartender shook his head, evidently torn. There's a woman, a witness. She saw what happened, but she doesn't want to get involved. The fear is great. Everyone here knows that David was in trouble, but no one wants to get involved. Please, can you give me her contact information? I need to talk to her, Sarah pleaded, sensing the urgency of the situation. The bartender hesitated again, but finally gave in. Her name is Clara. She works at a flower shop on Main Street. If you really want to know the truth, that's where you need to go. With new hope, Sarah thanked him and left the bar. She wasn't sure what she would find, but the possibility of a solid alibi for David motivated her to move forward. Upon arriving at the flower shop, the sweet smell of flowers was overwhelming, but the tension in her stomach was palpable. She searched for Clara among the colorful blooms until she spotted a short-haired, brown-haired woman with a nervous expression. "Clara?" Sarah approached, trying to appear welcoming. "I'm Sarah. I'm helping David. The bartender told me you might know something about what happened the night of the accident." The woman looked around as if searching for an exit. "I don't want any trouble. I saw what happened, but I don't want to get involved. It's dangerous." Clara's voice was shaky, and Sarah felt her heart race. "I understand, but David is being accused of something he didn't do. If you don't speak up, he could be convicted. Please, he needs you," Sarah pleaded, her gaze fixed on the woman's eyes. Clara hesitated, the internal struggle visible on her face. I don't know. I was there, but I don't want to get involved. They might come after me. If you don't speak up, David will pay for something he didn't do," Sarah said, her voice heavy with emotion. "I promise I'll do everything I can to protect you. You don't have to be afraid." Finally, Clara took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "All right, I'll talk, but we need to do this safely. I can't risk my life." With a renewed sense of hope, Sarah smiled. "Thank you. You don't know how much this means. We'll meet in a safe place, and I'll make sure you're protected." As Sarah spoke with Clara, she felt that she was finally moving in the right direction. The truth was starting to emerge, and with the help of this witness, maybe she could save David from an unjust fate. The adrenaline coursed through her veins, and the determination to fight for the truth intensified with every second. The courtroom was in absolute silence, the tension hanging in the air like a storm about to burst. Sarah scanned the room, the jurors' gazes fixed on the witness who was finally preparing to speak. It was a moment she had been anxiously awaiting, but also with a sense of trepidation. The prosecuting attorney, a middle-aged man with an unyielding gaze, was ready to launch his attack. The witness, a fragile-looking woman, stared at the floor, nervous, as her fingers intertwined. "Ma'am, please tell the court where you were on the night of the crime," the judge began, his voice firm but not without a hint of compassion. The woman slowly lifted her head, her eyes misty. I was at the bar on the corner. I saw David that night. He wasn't near the accident." Her voice trembled, but the words came out with a weight that reverberated in the room. Sarah felt a wave of hope, but it was quickly interrupted by the prosecuting attorney, who abruptly stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. This woman is an unreliable witness. There is no evidence to prove her presence at the scene." "And what if I can prove that?" the woman said, her voice now more assertive, as if a flame of determination had ignited within her. "I have a recording, a security video from the bar." The judge paused, clearly surprised. "Miss, are you saying you have a video that can corroborate your testimony?" "Yes, Your Honor." "I came prepared," the woman replied, pulling a small flash drive from her bag. "I didn't want to get involved, but when I heard what happened to David, I knew I had to speak up." The prosecuting attorney began to fidget. "This is irrelevant. We can't just accept recordings without proper analysis. I can bring the bar manager to confirm the authenticity of the recording," the woman insisted, her voice gaining strength. "David wasn't there. He was somewhere else." Sarah felt her heart race. It was everything she needed to turn the tide of the trial. "Please, accept the recording," she murmured to herself, as her thoughts danced between hope and anxiety. After a brief deliberation, the judge decided, "Let's listen to the recording. If it's pertinent, we will accept it as evidence." He signaled for the recording to be played, and the entire room fell silent, waiting. As the video began to roll, the shaky image of the bar appeared on the screen. Sarah watched intently, her heart pounding out of rhythm. The woman on screen was sitting at a table, laughing and chatting, and soon David appeared. But he wasn't alone. He was with a group of people who looked very different from him, faces Sarah recognized from her investigations into the crime network. "This isn't good," the prosecuting attorney murmured, now visibly nervous. He knew that recording could be the turning point of the case. David wasn't at the accident. He was being forced to associate with those people, Sarah thought as the recording continued to show David interacting with the group. When the video ended, the judge looked around the room, his expression neutral. "Miss, you stated that David was under pressure from a criminal group. Can you tell us more about that?" "Yes, The witness hesitated, but then took a deep breath. "I saw him being threatened. They said that if he didn't do what they told him, his life would be in danger. He didn't want to do it." The prosecuting attorney, sensing the tide turning, quickly stood up. "This is pure speculation. You have no concrete evidence that he was being forced. But I know the people he was with. They're not good. He was just trying to protect himself," the woman replied, her gaze now filled with determination. The judge watched her closely, his expression unchanged, but Sarah felt that the witness's words were creating a new narrative in the courtroom. The truth was beginning to emerge, and with it, the possibility of justice for David. The room had become a battlefield, where every word weighed like a sword. Sarah felt invigorated, her faith in altruism being tested but not broken. She knew she was getting closer to the truth she had fought so hard to reveal, and that her determination could not only save David but also expose the corruption that permeated his life and the lives of many others. This is just the beginning, she thought as she prepared for the next phase of the trial, aware that the fight was not over yet, but now she had a chance. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, almost palpable, as the trial approached its end. Sarah was sitting in her chair, her heart racing, feeling the pressure of all eyes on her. The heat from the courtroom lights seemed to intensify the anxiety in her chest. She could barely hear the murmur of the audience, who were anxiously awaiting the verdict. What was at stake was more than David's innocence. It was a fight for truth and justice in a system that often overlooked the vulnerable. The judge raised her hand, asking for silence. The room quieted down. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. She knew that, regardless of the outcome, her life would never be the same. Over the past few weeks, she had plunged into a world of uncertainties, threats, and revelations that had made her stronger but also more vulnerable. Her gaze met David's, who was sitting next to his lawyer, looking more confident than ever. The recent twist in the case, with the witness who had confirmed his alibi, had brought new life to his defense. When the judge asked the parties to prepare for closing arguments, Sarah stood up, her heart racing. She had rehearsed those words in her mind so many times that they now echoed in her head like a mantra. She walked to the center of the courtroom, feeling the weight of the moment. The jury watched her intently, and she began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady but laden with emotion. "Today, we are not here just to decide the fate of a man. We are here to affirm that justice still exists, that truth matters, and that everyone deserves a second chance." She paused, looking at David, who encouraged her with a slight nod. David is not just a name in a court case. He is a person, a human being who, like all of us, made mistakes. But he is also a man who was manipulated by forces much greater than he. Sarah's words reverberated in the room, and she felt the tension dissipate a little. In this courtroom, we have the responsibility not just to evaluate the evidence, but to consider the context. The truth is that David was caught in a web of crimes he did not choose. He was a pawn in a much bigger game, a game that destroys lives. The only thing he asked for was the chance to defend himself and tell his story. She looked at the prosecutor, who was sitting with a disdainful expression. "The prosecution wants you to see David as a heartless criminal. But do not be swayed by that narrative. Remember what you have heard here. Remember the voices that came forward to testify in his favor. Remember the truth that emerged, even amid the storm of lies and manipulations." Sarah's words seemed to have an effect on the jury. She could see some expressions soften, some eyebrows raise, as people reflected on what they were hearing. We, as a society, must be more than just judges of past actions. We must be advocates for the possibility of redemption. David is not a monster. He is a man who deserves a chance to rebuild himself. She took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline pushing her forward. If you have decided that truth is what really matters, then the only choice you can make is to declare David innocent. Not just for his life, but for the belief in a system that can and should protect those who are manipulated and unjustly accused. The room was in absolute silence. The jury withdrew to deliberate, and the agony of waiting began. Sarah sat down again, her heart racing, while David looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and hope. The prosecutor, who had seemed so confident before, was now visibly restless, shifting in his chair, his expression tense. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. The doors opened, and everyone stood up. The judge looked at the jury foreman, who stood up, holding the paper in his hands. The murmurs in the room grew louder, and the tension was almost unbearable. The jury finds the defendant not guilty. The juror's voice echoed through the room, and a muffled cry of relief escaped Sarah's lips. David froze for a second before rising in a sudden movement, tears in his eyes. Sarah smiled, but the joy was quickly mixed with the realization that the fight for truth had its price. She had sacrificed so much, and now the future awaiting her, with all its uncertainties, haunted her. After the tumult of the trial, Sarah felt exhausted, but a new flame burned within her. As she walked down the courthouse hallway, the feeling of relief and liberation enveloped her. David had been declared innocent, but the cost of that left her contemplating her future. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from a friend, inviting her to a meeting of an NGO fighting against injustice. She hesitated for a moment, but the idea of using her experience to help others overcome situations similar to what she and David had faced immensely attracted her. That night, Sarah found herself in a small community center where the NGO was based. The walls were decorated with photos of people who had been helped, and the atmosphere exuded a spirit of hope. Upon entering, she was greeted by a gray-haired man with a warm smile. "You must be Sarah. I've heard a lot about you. Your work in court was admirable," he praised, extending his hand. "Thank you. I just did what I thought was right," Sarah replied, a bit embarrassed. "Well, we're here to do what's right, together. Come, let's gather," he said, guiding her to a room where others were already seated. The conversation flowed naturally, and Sarah felt increasingly at ease. She shared her experience, how she had felt lost between her obligations and the fight for justice. The words seemed to heal the wounds that were still open. Meanwhile, David was rising up after the trial. He had become a symbol of overcoming and resilience, and he was determined to use his story to help others. In a nearby cafe, he met with a group of young people who had gone through similar struggles. "I know what it feels like to be hopeless," he began, looking into each of their eyes. "But truth and justice are powerful. Never let others define who you are." One of the young people, with tears in their eyes, asked, "Do you really believe we can change things?" "I believe, and I'm here to help you." "Together, we are stronger," David replied, his tone firm and encouraging. Meanwhile, Sarah and David began to reconnect. After the trial, they exchanged messages frequently. One day, David invited her for coffee. When they met, the atmosphere was charged with unspoken feelings. "You don't know how much you've helped me," David said, looking deeply into Sarah's eyes. "I just did what anyone would do." "You deserve a second chance," Sarah replied, a gentle smile on her face. "No, Sarah, you don't understand. You fought for me when no one else would." "That means everything," he insisted, grateful. She felt touched. "I just hope we can help others find their voices too." "Absolutely. I want our story to inspire others." "We need to do something about it," David said, determined. As the weeks went by, Sarah became increasingly involved in the NGO. With each new story she heard, her passion for justice grew. She organized a fundraising event where David was one of the keynote speakers. That night, he spoke with fervor, and the audience was captivated. At the end, many approached him, touched by the message of hope he conveyed. After the event, while they were talking, Jake appeared. His expression was one of regret. "Sarah, can we talk?" he asked, a bit hesitant. "Jake, I don't know if this is the right time," she started, but he interrupted her. "Please, just listen to me. I realized I was wrong not to support you. I didn't understand your passion. I only saw risk. But now, seeing what you and David are doing, I see it's bigger than both of us," Jake said, sincerity in his voice. Sarah hesitated, remembering the fights and the pain. "I don't know if I can trust you again. I understand, but I want to try. I'm willing to learn and get involved. You're amazing, Sarah, and I want to be part of this new phase of your life," he replied, vulnerability evident in his tone. She looked into his eyes, searching for a spark of the connection they once had. "Let's take it slow then. David and I are focused on helping people. If you want to join us, you're welcome, but we need to be honest with each other." Jake nodded, hopeful. "I accept. Let's do this together." That night, Sarah felt stronger than ever. She had found a new purpose alongside David and, perhaps, a new chance to understand love and friendship with Jake. Together, they were ready to face the future, determined to fight for truth and justice, united by a selflessness that now formed a part of their lives. I sincerely hope that you were enchanted by this story. I'm sure the next video that appears to you will also touch your heart. So, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our next stories. A big hug and see you next time.